Guys, we're going to get started because we know, even though there are people who might be coming in, we're hoping they'll go in through the other doors. But if we don't start now, we won't have a chance to finish the program, and we want to make sure you get to the plenum on time. So I'm going to start by saying good afternoon, and it is so good to see everyone here today. Welcome to Encouraging Inclusion When Welcoming Isn't Enough. Our program is brought to you by Mishpacha, the Modern Jewish Family. We're part of the network of educational programs which are a benefit for members of WLCJ. And our purpose for the last 2 years has been to present programs that explore issues that challenge and affect Jewish families. I'm Fran Shivitz Hildebrand. I was the chair of WLCJ's Mishpacha committee, as well as the lead for inclusion until installation last night. Now, I'm a WLCJ vice president and co-chair of the brand new committee that's called Kahila. Thank you. I'm still the immediate past president of CGLR, and I'm very proud that we're the host region of this convention. And I am thrilled that Denise Brand will be taking over as Mishpacha chair. Assisting me today is Michelle Sussman, who is sisterhood co-president of Congregation Beth Judea in Long Grove, Illinois, and who has been part of our Mishpacha committee for the last 2 years. And what she is going to be doing today in particular is scribing for us. And we're a green convention as much as possible. And so what we'll do is we have a sign-up list. She's going to take notes that you can come up afterwards, take pictures of, or we will transcribe and send you. And any of the materials that we discuss and reference, we have a handout we're going to pass around, and you can sign up, and we'll send you directly to your email what we have, all of our attachments and materials. So this program today reflects one of today's issues that revolve around family, sisterhood, and synagogue, encouraging inclusion when welcoming isn't enough. In a few minutes, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Allie Drum, who is Director of Congregational Learning of North Suburban Synagogue Bethel in Highland Park, and Mindy Gordon, USCJ Synagogue Consultant for the Central District, and Ariana Burrows, who is Treasurer of the Mid-Atlantic Region and WLCJ Representative of FJMC, USCJ, RA, WLCJ, Committee on Inclusion and Interfaith. That was a mouthful. WLCJ has a proud history of promoting inclusion and diversity. In 2014, we passed the Equal Rights, Inclusion and Disabilities Resolution, and in 2020, we passed the LGBTQ+ resolutions. There were 2 of them. And these resolutions call on our sisterhoods to create and sustain welcoming communities that advocate for them and promote a personal sense of belonging. There's a lot more to these resolutions, a lot more, but time does not permit me to describe them. And instead, the websites where you can find that information on the WLCJ Thank you, Vanna. You can access them. Recently, this year, WLCJ published the Inclusion Resource Guidebook. Here, Vanna. Here's the rest of it, but that we developed from our partner, the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. And you can also find that not just on the WLCJ website with a lot of attachments that go with this, But also it's been published in the WL week newsletter every week since January. So it's easy to download. And some of the folks who were on that committee are here today. Geraldine Payne, Ariana Burrows, Denise Brand, and Nancy Goldberg. So I wanted to give a shout out to them because they were part of this also. For those who would like to watch our program again, or recommend it to one of your, WLCJ friends, we're recording today's program. The link to the recording will be posted on the WLCJ.org website under the convention tab. So our format today is an informal panel in which questions will be developed directed towards specific speakers. And I'm going to apologize right up front. These are weighty questions. And even though our speakers really wanted a lot more time, they are going to do the best that they can to be as brief and concise as they can. But you will have their emails if you want to get in touch with them. So since time is short, we're going to cover as much as we can. We'll pass this around. Michelle, would you mind? Here's a pen. And we're going to get started. So this first question is going to go to all three of you. And that is, let's start with Ariana, and we'll just kind of move our way down. And that question is, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in inclusion, or your synagogue, or your organization.
I am a past president of my congregation, Melrose B'nai Israel Emmanuel in Elkins Park, and a past president and pastoral fund chair of the sisterhood of my congregation. Fran mentioned that I was on that committee, and I helped to write and edit the Inclusion Resource Guidebook. I subscribe to the definition of inclusion that is in the guidebook, which is that it's a practice or policy of extending equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, and welcoming, respecting, and valuing diverse identities and communities of people. As for my congregation, its sole articulated focus has been on embracing and providing accommodations to encourage the full participation of persons with physical disabilities. And that focus has informed our annual disability awareness programs. We have a wheelchair accessible Torah table on the sanctuary floor, and an upgraded microphone system, as well as plastic magnifying sheets for Sidurim and Chumashim, mezuzot affixed at lower levels, and copies of large print Lev Shalem. Our current congregation leader recently assured me that we were already warm and welcoming, which is perhaps an example of when welcoming isn't totally all you need. But I haven't given up. At my insistence, the leader and also the chair of our inclusion committee attended the Mishpacha programs that Fran organized this past year with Keshet, which works for full equality of LGBTQ Jews. My intention is to spur the broadening of my shul's inclusion perspective to embrace other underserved communities.
Thank you, Ariana.
I am Allie Drone. By title, I'm the director of congregational learning, like she said, at North Suburban Synagogue Beth-El. Congregational learning really being a stand-in for, when you want to be inclusive of all kinds. And I feel that our congregation really does apply the broadest possible definition of inclusion. When you're talking about inclusion, yes, you're talking about Jews of color. Yes, you're talking about LGBTQIA+. Yes, you're talking about discrimination that we could have by age, by physical ability, single adults, married adults, children who don't only want to be defined as having interests by age. I began my career working in youth parts of our community. And, not all 10th graders want to hang out with only 10th graders. Like it really, when you talk about inclusion, it's about opening up your community to the broadest possible definition of inclusion and really slowing down your programming process to think through, how does this work for this part of our community? How does this work for that part of our community? And trying to be as inclusive as possible. Really, all of us, if it's going to be inclusive, it's going to include us all.
Hi, I'm Mindy Gordon, and I am the synagogue consultant for USCJ for the Central District. I am also a member of North Suburban Synagogue and the synagogue and the sisterhood there as well. So it's nice to have you all here. At USCJ, like Ali said, we think that you have to take the broadest possible picture of inclusion. And really, it all starts with something we do a lot of, is called relational Judaism. So I actually brought this book with me, and this will be in the notes also that we have, but it's called Relational Judaism, and it's by Dr. Ron Wolfson. And if you haven't read it, I would very much suggest reading it. We've done a lot of workshops on it, and like the title for here, our subtitle is always When Name Tags Are Not Enough. So sometimes we judge our programs by how many people we get in our program. We say, oh, there were 300 people. Wow, that was a successful program. But if 150 of them walked out with no one saying hello to them, they won't be back. So I believe that working on these relationships is the first step and a very important one. Also at USCJ, we do now have specialists to work with all the different types of inclusion, such as we have a full-time person who works on interfaith. We have a full-time person who works with Jews of color. We partner with Keshet to work with LGBT. We partnered with Ruderman for a long time on physical and emotional and mental differences.
Thanks. And so as of course, what we're finding out is there are as many definitions of inclusion as different groups of people. So our next question then, let's talk more generally about how we create a welcoming and non-judgmental atmosphere in our synagogues and sisterhoods. How do we develop that mindset? And I'm going to direct that at Ali and at Mindy.
Okay, I'll go first. So one thing that I think is very important is to think about is, who are your gatekeepers? All of the sessions that we do at USCJ when we do board training start with text study. And I'm going to have this in the packet also, is a text that's called Hillel on the Roof. And just to summarize it quickly for you, it was about a shul regular. We used to always go, and then one day they were charging to show up, and he didn't have the money. So whoever it was sent him away. And he was on the roof, covered by snow, trying to listen in to what was happening. It's really a very heartbreaking picture. And then the regulars noticed that they couldn't see out of their roof, and it was because he was up there. So really the lesson that we learned from this is who's taking the calls, right? You can think that you're being super welcoming, but if whoever you have taking your calls and taking the initial input doesn't ask the right questions about what are your needs, accessibility wise, food wise, all of those different things, then ultimately you're not going to be able to have a successful inclusion program. Because it starts from whoever the first point of contact is.
And I spoke about this briefly just now, but to say that we need to slow down our programming process. I think, we often look at a blank calendar or a blank schedule of a conference, and we're quick trying to fill it with whoever we can, who's available, who's, and you find someone, you're like, great, I got that session, let's move forward. And I think that does not lend itself to thinking through the process of inclusion. To think about, I think the Women's League has done an incredible job of putting together a conference, but thinking about what's our line of sight here in a room, no one's fault, in a room with big pylons in the middle of the room, how do you arrange the chairs so that everyone can get through to the aisle? I know we were just talking about our synagogue that's reorganizing the chairs in the sanctuary. And I think this is an important, part of the thought process. How do people find out about the event? Are you only publicizing it on a certain kind of place where a certain kind of person will notice it? You know, have you thought through the timing, the menu? Is it inclusive of everybody who might be coming? Have we processed, are we aware that like having gluten-free, you know, things helps with someone who has autism? You know, and that was also before when you said sort of how our congregation, as an example, defines inclusion, is it also talks about not just physical disabilities, but different developmental abilities, different issues of, you know, sort of gender expression or interfaith families. And I know that there, you know, we've spoken about that a lot as a movement, but that's part of the process of thinking through inclusion. If you want to be inclusive, you know, I think of it always through an educational lens. And our congregation does, which I'm sure so do many congregations, do a lovely sort of sixth grade family exploration curriculum. You know, if the prompts for your educational curriculum all ask about sort of the same type of inclusion, this is a great example, actually. You know, then that's not inclusive. You know, then that's not inclusive. So part of it is, you know, it doesn't cost anything but time. But you do have to take that time to kind of go through who are your target audiences. If your target audience is the whole congregation or the whole community, then it's going to take you a minute to go through sort of all of these filters on your, you know, spreadsheet of inclusion, right? It's also okay. I want to just share that I think that it is okay that not every program has to be for every possible, you know, filter on that drop down spreadsheet, right? It's okay. It's not to say that I don't think that crosses the boundary of inclusion and welcoming. But once you say you're doing, you know, I come from a congregational setting. So if you're doing a congregational program, then it's every single filter. And you really have to think, what are we doing for kids? Is there childcare? Is there a place for nursing? Is there wheelchair accessibility? Is there gluten-free and vegetarian things on the, and non-dairy and et cetera, non-dairy things on the menu? You really have to use all your filters. But it is okay to do programming that is directed in a more specific direction, because guess what? Each of those categories is going to come with its own list of, you know, inclusion and what that looks like. For some apply to all programming, but some apply only if you're doing programming with children or only if you're doing programming for single adults. So it's okay to filter sometimes for a particular category, but still you need to take that time, I think, to work through how to be inclusive of everyone. And I don't know if we're taking questions now or save it later. Okay, but write it down or something so you don't forget.
I didn't mean to grab it.
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, well, two things. Number one, if you have a question, if you can write it down, we're hoping that we'll be able to answer everything at the end. We're trying to stay focused if we can. And the other is, are you able to hear us? Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. And that's sort of, Allie, that speaks to what we went through at meals about making sure that individuals who ordered special meals because of that received it. I'm going to direct this back at you, Allie, for the next one as well. So the question then is, how do we get community buy-in? And of course, by community, I'm referring to whether it's your sisterhood, your synagogue, your organization.
Well, maybe you would expect this answer from me as an education director, but I'm going to say education is really important to sort of how do you cover your bases and start to learn and become more inclusive. I do want to say, and I know we'll maybe not all have the same opinion about this, I do not think that knowing someone in the category to be named is a precursor to programming for them. Otherwise, I think we would be really severely limited in our ability to program. So, if I don't know, I don't know anyone who's LGBTQIA+, how can I program for them? I think we have to educate ourselves to have a goal of understanding what are some general needs that people have who have ADHD? What are some general needs of people who have vision challenges or mobility challenges? What are some general things that you might want to know about single parents? You know, it's okay if you don't know those people to be able to help program for them. The other thing I want to say is that not everyone who fits in a particular category of, we'll say, category of inclusion has the same opinion. You know, I reference teenagers because I have that history, but you know, not by saying not all 10th graders want to hang out with only 10th graders, and not all Jews of color only want to be known as a Jew of color. They might just want to be known as a Jew, a woman, a man, a resident of your town. Like it's not necessarily that you're constantly representing what makes you unique, even though it is a special, important part of you and it should be welcomed and we should be thoughtful about our programming. But I think that's something to think about when we think about inclusion. Education first, and that sessions discussing diversity don't have to be a precursor to welcoming. But I'm always going to say more educational sessions to learn.
As a former teacher and counselor, that speaks to my heart. The next question, and I know we're talking fast and I'm going to apologize, but we want to make sure that we cover as much as we can for all of you. So the next question is also going to be directed at Allie and Mindy, and that is, what are some strategies, practices, programs that you could suggest that we could take home with us to try? Now, we will have other materials, so we're not expecting them to give 20 items each, but some ones that you think are good places to start.
So I did bring with me, and it will be in your packet after, something that we created called a community building checklist, a relational approach to events. And it's 2 pages, and it has basically pre-event, publicity, frontline welcoming, connectors, read over the attendance list. Have you checked for new people who you can seek out to welcome, or for current members, we're expanding this more in specific inclusion that fit in these different demographic categories. Getting there, have you made sure people are able to get there? Schedule relational time, like I was talking about the program where you had 300 people, but 150 of them left with no one asking their name. Make sure, and again, with inclusion, make sure that people are going up to people and being welcoming. Rooms set up, we talked about signage, we talked about. And then at the event, I'm not going to read you the whole list, which I now started out to do, but you get the idea. And then, of course, the most important part that we often don't do is the post-event evaluation and debrief and data gathering. Who was there? Whose needs did we serve? Whose needs did we not serve? And then the last point I want to make is it's a little spin on what Allie said. So just we discussed this when we were talking ahead of time. I definitely agree that you don't need to be in that specific category to program for that category. But I do believe that if you have people in that category, that it would be great to try to include them. So, for example, raise your hand if you were in ORT. I was very involved with ORT, and we were trying very hard. We'll answer what it stands for another time. We were very involved with trying to get, of course, like everybody, the next gen. So we were making all these programs for the next gen. Well, they weren't the slightest bit interested in the things that we were saying that they were going to be interested in. So the same, if you have some interfaith families, ask them to hold something in their house. Et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I think is, if we're talking about best practices, but not necessarily exclusive.
Absolutely agree. The other thing I would say is there are things that you can do by way of inclusion that you might not have put in this category before, but they're just good practices, like would be on the list that Mindy referenced about, wayfinding. Our congregation is a labyrinthine building, and we're like to say things like, "Oh, meet us in the GB," and what does that mean to someone who either has been a part of the community for a long time but doesn't reference the Grossinger Berkman activity room as the GB, and when being aware of the lingo you use at all times. I actually just came from visiting my son at camp at Visitors Day, and I was impressed by how his counselor was translating all of the sort of camp lingo that the kids were referencing throughout the whole experience, so that you, as the parent of the child at camp, don't feel like an outsider, on Visitors Day. And I think we do that and we think of that, but like many things in the realm of inclusion, we probably don't do it enough. And so, when we want to give ourselves an assessment, sometimes we can say we're doing a great job at that. But, really, I think if we think about it, we fall into habits, as is totally understandable to do, where we don't always transliterate, give all of that at the same time. We don't always refer to, wayfinding as an example. in its detailed form. And, you know, and I really want to underline and highlight something Mindy just said about debrief, because I think a lot of times nobody takes that time to, after the event, after the program, to really analyze some of the aspects that went really well, sometimes by happenstance and sometimes by design. And I think sometimes that can lead you to, well, we thought we were very welcoming to families with young children, but until a lesbian couple with a deaf partner came to our last event, and then we were standing there and I didn't know how to say anything but Shabbat Shalom in sign language. And so, you know, this is good debrief, good chance to kind of think through, are we really as, you know, welcoming as we think we are? And I know we're going to speak about assessment, but that was sort of the real life assessment of a recent program that we had, where, you know, you go to good amount of effort in advance to be welcoming, and so welcoming, in fact, that family came to our event, and then there was nothing for us. We couldn't even talk to one of the parents because we don't speak sign language. So, you know, it was something, you know, I think it's sort of a good experience of ego to understand that as welcoming and as inclusive as you want to be, it would be challenging to be completely welcoming and inclusive unless I was able to speak sign language to this beautiful family that came to our event. So, you know, it's sort of something that you should sort of simultaneously give yourself a pat on the back, and that should push you forward a little bit to your next level, because, you know, you did a good job, go team, and move forward and keep trying, because inclusion is really it's a lifestyle.
And I think one of the things that you're talking about is the fact that we oftentimes, at least some of the programs that I've attended, talk about all the physical kinds of accommodations that we make. And those are great and they're necessary, but what you're talking about is creating a mindset where you're looking at the person and trying to come up with what will make them feel more welcoming, even if it's gluten-free food, or knowing the vocabulary, or having other kinds of things that reflect on the individual. And the only way you know that is if you afterwards sit down and say, okay, were we able to do this? And where did we do a great job? And where didn't we? So this next question is going to go to Ariana. And this one is, you were so involved with the inclusion guidebook. Are there any, and we have a lot of programs and resources that we can tap into. I mean, that's just one resource for programming and for other kinds of things, but it's a really good start for us. Would you mind talking about, with so many possibilities available in there, are there any programs or accommodations or resources that you think would be really great for them to tap into at the beginning?
Yes, the Inclusion Resource Guidebook is really a tremendous resource, and I'd recommend either of two programs through which your sisterhood and congregation would give your members a broad perspective on inclusion. In one program that I have in mind, your sisterhood would collaborate with your inclusion committee on several Shabbatot spread out throughout the year, each highlighting and welcoming a different underserved community. You can partner with a specialized agency, for example, Keshet, for fostering full acceptance of LGBTQ Jews, or Jews in all hues to fully embrace Jews of color, or Respectability to promote full participation for differently abled Jews, and so on. I am really keen, though, on another program, because you can bring the values of inclusion directly to children by refreshing your B'nai Mitzvah preparations from an inclusionary perspective. I suggest you do this incrementally, a little bite at a time, and according to the children from underserved communities that are actually in your school program. It might not surprise you that your program is serving children with mental or physical challenges. Often, the school may already be providing sensitive accommodations. But if there's a required mitzvah project, that might be worrisome for an adolescent with special needs or developmental concerns. It could relieve some stress on the family to have the support from an adult volunteer, perhaps from your sisterhood, who would develop a relationship with the team and then work together on the mitzvah project. Or say perhaps you find in your program children from non-traditional families, very likely, I would say, single parent headed, LGBTQ parents, or interfaith families. Care may be taken to ameliorate any sense of family isolation and to ensure that all parents are invited to fully participate in their child's ritual experience. Maybe in a little while after that, you find in your B'nai Mitzvah program, there are children of color who may well have experienced discrimination or at least tension in public school or community settings. This is your opportunity to ensure that children of color are warmly embraced, not only in the school itself, but also in the school's youth activities and with invites to B'nai Mitzvah parties. As the process of refreshing your B'nai Mitzvah program continues, you could find that there are children of a more fluid gender or who are non-binary or who identify with LGBTQ+ community. Some congregations have rebranded their B'nai Mitzvah program as preparation for the gender-neutral B Mitzvah or Ba Mitzvah. Other congregations inquire what pronouns the children and families choose for themselves, and then conscientiously use those pronouns that the children and families prefer. A 2022 paper adopted by our conservative movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards suggests other Hebrew alternative phrases to honor gender diversity in place of the gendered call to the Torah, Ya'amod, Ta'amod. The paper suggests the phrase Na La'amod, which means simply, please stand. The paper also gives other alternative phrases you might check out and wish to consider, perhaps, at least for these children. All inclusionary efforts that you make for your B'nai Mitzvah program would not only benefit the child, but might also connect the family more strongly and more long-term with your congregation.
Thanks, Ariana. You gave us a lot of interesting ideas. I really like them. Okay, we're going to now turn to assessment. And I'm going to ask Allie and Mindy to talk about how do we measure how inclusive our sisterhood or our synagogue really is. And are there benchmarks we can use or measurements we can take to determine where we fall on the inclusion continuum? And if in fact, our organization has gone beyond a welcoming smile.
So I'm not multitasking on my phone, but I have the document here on my phone and it'll also be in the packet. But so we've created an assessment, relational Judaism assessment, in which we have different categories such as creating personal encounters, helping people tell stories, learning together, connecting and caring. And then we have, and I would suggest that you use this at your debrief, and we have a great deal, somewhat, the general 5-point scale of how something like this is measured. And I would suggest that you make this assessment part of your debrief. And I want to take just half a step back because we skipped an important step. Before you can assess it, you need to set what your goals are. And so for each program, I think it's very important. We all try to take on as Jewish women too much at one time. And so I think that it's very important, like Allie said, you can't be programming for everybody all at once. You have to decide what are our goals here. And then once you've set your goals and you know what your goals are, then you can see if you achieve them by doing, you don't have to use my form, but using some kind of form that will be able to say if you achieved your goals. But if you didn't set out your goals to begin with, then you really have no way of evaluating whether you achieved anything or not. So that's why I'm a huge proponent of written goals, so that you can go back to them and look at them and then be able to assess how it went.
I really like what Mindy shared about the idea of breaking down sort of what your goals were. And I think the idea of taking the time to sort of create the list of how you plan to be, in this case, more inclusive after an event or a program or an initiative is really important and helpful. The two things I just wanted to mention, because I don't, for me, getting too stuck on the assessment, it's more helpful in the planning process of the next, school year or set of, semester of adult learning or something from in my sphere. But I'll say that there are things, I think sometimes there are things that you don't consider as being part of an inclusion process that I just want to encourage everyone to sort of really, like I said, our congregation defines inclusion in the broadest possible terms. And so, for example, when I first started to serve on in a disability inclusion function, we spent a ton of time on menu. And, I had to really understand over time, why are we spending so much time on menu? It's actually incredibly important, having, and I'll just say I was privileged to travel recently in Europe, and I was impressed to see every menu at every little tiny dive pub in every little town had, 7 pages at the back explaining the allergens on their pub menu. And, what is gluten-free and what is vegetarian, what has sesame and one has this. You can't imagine how much that actually has to do with inclusion. Many different conditions, especially in children and in the category of behavioral challenges, are triggered by gluten, as an example. So it may not be a straight up allergy that you're looking out for. It may be another type of challenge that a person is facing, that if you just make sure that you have gluten-free items on the menu at your program, you are already taken another step towards inclusion. So I just want to highlight things like what you serve at the program or at the class, etc. event is really part of your efforts towards inclusion. And the other thing I'll say, because we've been referencing specifically LGBTQIA+, and when you're thinking of a program that's going to include children, something that you can also do in similar to the way we call up people to the Torah is to just, when you're referencing a child's family members, to just say something like, you're adults. You're adults, because maybe you're being raised by your great aunt, maybe you're being raised by your grandparents, maybe you're being raised by your two mothers. It's irrelevant to the program, right? You just want the kid and their adults to come to, maybe they're being watched by a family friend because whoever normally watches them is out of town, right? So it's just a question of bring your adults. Whatever adults are with you, you bring those to the program. So sometimes it's, there is really important work that we need to do to make our congregations physically accessible, to make our congregations welcoming to a number of different types of humans. But there are also things that you can do that cost nothing but your time to think through, have we thought this angle of the program? Have we thought that angle of the program? So I just want to empower people to feel like, our sisterhood or our congregation doesn't have the kind of resources that, say, North Suburban Synagogue Bethel does, so therefore we can't blank. And I want to empower you to say, you can absolutely blank, it's the time and the effort that you put in will make your event and your community welcoming. And there's so many things that you can do in addition to the important work that I would also encourage you to do to make places physically more accessible. But for example, when Mindy referenced the list of all the different, sort of assessment categories, several of them were about people. Like, is there a human, let's say that your front door is not wheelchair accessible. If there's a human standing there and someone comes in with a wheelchair, then it becomes more accessible because they're helping someone in the door, right? So you can overcome some of the costly types of inclusion by, human power. I just want to empower us around that. So, yeah.
Giving us a lot to think about. And it's not all about money either. It's really, again, relationships. Okay, Ariana, this is directed toward you. Can you tell us, using the assessment guide, and of course, we can all access this survey. It's not part of the inclusion guidebook, but it is on the WLCJ.org website. How can that assessment guide be used also to see how welcoming we are?
In moving your sisterhoods and your congregations toward creating an environment that makes us all feel embraced by our Jewish community, you'll find that every component of inclusion exists on a continuum. The self-assessment guide can help you detect where you are on each continuum, giving your sisterhood, your congregation, an indication on what areas you might want to seek improvement. For example, the first suggestion is to work with an existing or establish a diversity and inclusion committee to expand inclusion opportunities in areas that we have identified as underserved community priorities. You assess where you are on that continuum. Are we okay, not okay, or in between? And then you answer, maybe we should ... If your answer when you look at where you are and you have no inclusion committee yet, maybe your answer to maybe we should is to start to put one in place. But if you have an active inclusion committee, you just haven't focused on all areas of underserved community, that might be an indication of some areas to recalibrate your direction. The self-assessment guide is really for your use only. You're welcome to seek help, of course, from Women's League. And the Women's League website also includes a Speakers Bureau request form. So you can get assistance in creating an inclusion policy. And that's in addition to plenty of examples that you will find in the Inclusion Resource Guidebook.
Thanks, Ariana. So we are moving right along, and I've run out of questions. One last question. Is there something that you would like to share that we haven't talked about before we open it up to questions from the folks who are with us today?
I thought of one thing, just insofar as you are all here and at our session, and we thank you for that. I think often the best advice comes from each other. So rather than for us sitting up here and making suggestions, so I think that the best way is to try to, keep in touch with each other. And I don't know, at Women's League, if you do that online or if you do that through your leaders or all the different ways. And I would encourage you, if you're just a little plug, if you're at synagogues that are members of USCJ, then each one of you has a synagogue consultant like me. And some of you, I am your synagogue consultant. And we are also super happy. Like, I see my job is kind of gathering, best practices from everywhere. So when you do get into like the nitty gritty of planning, which we, haven't been able to talk about in 1 hour, turn to each other or turn to us to help you with that.
I'll just pass along a minute of advice that I got at an inclusion seminar that United Synagogue ran, because I think there's a question of like, I am a white heterosexual married parent, what could I say anything about inclusion, as an educator or really as a human. And there was some empowering advice given by someone at an inclusion seminar that was talking about how if for no other reason, which for most of us, there are many other reasons, but if for no other reason, eventually physical disability inclusion will be all of us, so 100%, all of us are eventually going to need inclusion. And it could be because, you break your leg skiing, but it could be because God willing, we all merit to grow old. And the older we grow, the things we may not be able to do even that we can do now. And so it's something to think about. Inclusion is really all of us. It's absolutely all of us. And so that's something that I found empowering when I said, it's like for my future self, if for no other reason, but really it's for all of our community members that we need to think about inclusion.
I want to pick up on something that Ali mentioned for sisterhoods and congregations who are a little newer to the idea of inclusion. I want to say you can move in a positive direction with little or no cost and not having done tons of research. You lead from the heart. So I remember a decade or so back, We didn't talk about inclusion. We had chesed committees, we didn't have inclusion committees. My shul certainly didn't have a custom design paid for Torah table on the sanctuary floor, but there was an elderly gentleman who couldn't possibly get up on the bima, and he deserved an aliyah. So the rabbi and Gabayim just brought the Torah down to him for the before and after blessing. He couldn't touch the words in the Torah with his talit, but Mishka Fairlech. And I remember, and I'm just picturing now how I felt doing this mitzvah, and we all felt like we were doing the mitzvah for this gentleman, and it felt great. And over the years, my shul has welcomed Jews of color and non-traditional families in our ritual activities. Would I like for there to be programs highlighting that we welcome Jews of color and non-traditional families, and for there to be that language on our website? Yeah, but leading from the heart is a good start.
Everything you said for me was very inspiring, so thank you. I'd like to, at this point, open up, we have about 15 minutes. So I'd like to ask if anyone has questions, and I see they do. So let's start with Marcia and then Gilda, and we'll move on.
So a little bit was said about a subject here. My heart is physical disabilities. They won't be able to. A lot of people are not gonna. And then wait, one down. We're gonna ask you to do this because it's recording. Yeah, I'm not gonna say. You're fine. So most of you know that I am partially in a wheelchair. I walk around a little bit. I was for a time permanently in a wheelchair, and I will again be permanently in a wheelchair. So that is something I really look at. And I understand that you said you can't always have people with those problems on your committee, but if you're talking about physical disabilities, you need to have someone in a walker or a wheelchair on your committee. I can promise you that when they set up that room over there, they didn't have anybody. I can't even go through that room without anyone in it. And my synagogue, they put a ramp up to what I'm going to call, I mean, it's where the ark is, right? But our bima is in the middle. There's no ramp to our bima. And you talk about having a person open the door for you when you walk in. Great. What about the ladies' room? What about the classrooms? So you really need somebody walking through there with you, telling you what the problems are. The city of Austin had a disabilities committee. They were all in wheelchairs, every one of them. So just think about that when you're doing things like your synagogue.
It wouldn't hurt to have a physical or occupational therapist on your committee as well. Really. I have a question that probably deserves another session, but I'm going to say to Marcia first. When I was in graduate school, I did my master's project on accessibility in the city of Cincinnati, and this was back in the mid-70s. And they had curb cuts on one side of the street and not on the other. And I remember it was like, now what? What happens here? Okay, I'm going to open a can of worms. What about your religious schools? Your training for your religious school teachers? And what do you do about a religious school teacher who point blank told a preschool parent that child does not belong here? Oh, that should not be done. Well, it happens to be my grandkid, so.
Can you expand on for what reason? Or
Is that a physical disability or mental?
She has autism, and they actually offered to come with her every week. But I personally think the teachers need a lot more training than the school. I see a lot of stuff, I hear it kind of on the periphery because I'm not there anymore. I'm a special ed teacher, by the way. I'm not there on a regular basis anymore, but I heard enough about what's going on with kids that need one-on-one attention. They definitely need something, but can we get help from, UCSJ, or I know I got
that's close enough.
I'm close enough.
Yeah.
Or, where do we go? And how does a parent, a grandparent, a concerned congregant go into that school and say, hey, guys, we need to be doing something here? This is not right.
You should.
Well, they do.
Michelle, I assume Gilda wants an answer.
Strap in. I'm sorry that that happens in your experience. And I want to echo that you're not alone. Especially, I will just say, especially at this stage of the, I don't like to say post-pandemic, but at this stage of all of our experiences of the pandemic, the needs in a school setting are, I'll put it in the words of one of my fellow educators, whereas before, 5 years ago, they were looking at a school with sort of 20% of their school needing a special kind of accommodation and 80% able to cope with whatever they normally were offering. It's really now flipped. There are about 80% of the school needs a special accommodation and only 20% can handle the program as it has been. And that is a unique challenge for schools right now. Religious schools, day schools, summer camp experiences, youth experiences. I mean, we're really all very much in that challenge right now. And I think I'd love to be able to talk to you more and offer some concrete suggestions. And I think we had said that we know that the post-panel conversations that we hope to all continue to have are going to be more impactful than anything I can quickly say in a soundbite up here. So I hear you, if that's enough of an answer for the moment.
And interestingly, her preschool teacher, regular, also pointed out that right now they're getting all these COVID kids in. And that it's causing, kids that were born during COVID, and it's an issue. No, they were in their houses for 2 years.
Some of them lack social skills.
I know we have.
So Geraldine, Michelle's on our way back to you. We're trying to be respectful of time. So after Geraldine, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give my thank you conclusion. And then anyone who wants to stay and ask other questions can do so. But we want to make sure we respect your time. Go ahead, Geraldine.
Can you hear me? Okay, I want to make sure I'm heard. I am a beautiful Black woman, proud to be full figure. And I'm not that shy. So I may not have some of the issues that I've heard from other people of color who go into the conservative synagogues. And please don't take this personally, but welcome people. People want to feel like they belong. Don't ignore them. If you see people sitting together because they don't feel comfortable spreading out among you. So it's your responsibility to go, hi, how you doing? Which I'm so glad you're here. You don't need to say, well, are you a convert or whatever, but some of what I've heard and having worked on this committee across the country, I talked to many people, okay? And we have issues in the conservative movement. So I'm saying, be aware of what your attitude is. Welcome. They want to, this is the word, belong. Okay, so having said that, I have a question. We have one member who is a Jew of color. What kind of program should we think about presenting? Question mark. A Jewish program? You say that, but think about it some more. Okay? Think about it broadly. Go out of your own vision and think about that even more. Okay, to include some of the other tribes and things of that nature who may not look European. I'm just saying, you do what you want, but. And then call me and I'll tell you how to go about it, okay?
First of all, that was awesome. I will just quote an amazing colleague, Rabbi Annie Tucker, if you know her, in the New York area, but used to be in our region. She had an incredible response when her congregation said, you know, she's a single woman rabbi, and people said, well, how are you going to advise like married couples with their challenges or parents with their challenges? How are you going to, you know, and she said, and I'm also not an alcoholic, but I would love to be able to speak to congregants who are having challenges with drug abuse in their family or in their own lives. And so the idea is, and I love what you're saying, just because someone is not part of our planning committee, someone is not in the room of our congregation, doesn't excuse us from welcoming, doesn't excuse us from learning. And so, you know, maybe as the educator on the panel, I just really want to say, like, I think it is our obligation to continue to learn. And you said it better, and it is our obligation to continue to welcome.
So I would love to be able to have everyone speak, and anyone who would like to is welcome to stay. But I would like to take a minute to thank Allie and Mindy and Ariana. You were informative, you were thought-provoking, you gave us a lot of information, and as did some of the rest of you out here as well, that we can think about, reflect, use in our everyday lives, take back to our sisterhoods, our synagogues, our organizations, as we navigate how to be more inclusive in our actions, our words, and our feelings. And I appreciate your time and effort and commitment to being part of this program. And so I want to thank the convention and WLCJ leadership for their support, and especially to Michelle, who acted as Vanna White and did a much better job as Vanna. And I would like to.
Vanna White hasn't had a raise at 18.
So I would like to thank all of you as well who came today, your comments, your questions, your suggestions. My hope is that you leave this program today feeling empowered and inspired to be the change that Mahatma Gandhi encouraged us to become. You are the stepping stones to a better future for all of us. And we need to heed the words that we've heard today. Thank you all for coming.